Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. Well, the votes are in, and the prophets won out, at least in this video, so we will be taking a look at the prophet or the minor prophet, Zechariah. As part of one of the minor prophets, the book or the prophet of Zechariah has not garnered much attention from scholarship from the likes, say, the Pentateuch or Jeremiah or Isaiah in the past 2 centuries, sadly. And as a result, literature on the literary themes, genre, the date, and the authorship have also been scanned when compared against the major prophets in the historical books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Exodus, and Genesis, and so on. So if you guys like this sort of content, don't hesitate to hit that like button. And as always, subscribe. And if you guys wish to support the channel financially, I'll go ahead and leave a link to my Patreon in the description below as well. And finally, and as I always do, I will be leaving the sources in the description below as well. It doesn't really work with the fingers and stuff. So anyway, in an attempt to show love towards the book of Zechariah and the prophet, this paper therefore will argue in favor of single authorship for the book of Zechariah, beginning with the scholarship that led to this point, the strengths and weaknesses of the single and multiple authorships of Zechariah, and finally the similarities and dissimilarities of the authorship of Zechariah against the backdrop of both the Pentateuchal authorship and Isaianic authorship. What that actually means is we'll be looking at Zechariah and how the authorship developed over the past 2 centuries, and then put it against the backdrop of the Pentateuch and Isaiah. Unity in dating of the book of Zechariah went for the better part of a millennium and a half, unchallenged until the rise of critical scholarship. And though criticism and love for the book of Zechariah still remain rather unpopular within the field of biblical studies and the Old Testament, the prophetic author has garnered some attention, at least. Critical scholars have divided the book into Proto, Deutero, and finally Trito Zechariah, much like Isaiah, which will be discussed later. Additionally, scholars have separated chapters 9 through 14 among these purported authors. So we've got chapters 1 through 8 as part of Proto Zechariah, and 9 through 14 as part of Deutero as Zechariah. And some scholars posit a Trito Zechariah, much like the book of Isaiah. And again, I'm focusing on the development of authorship. So differences in genre and theme with the chapters 1 through 8 lead to the frequent identification of chapters 9 through 14 as a later addition by Deutero Zechariah. Some would also classify chapters 12 through 14 as a distinct section called Trito Zechariah as well. For example, Deutero Zechariah seemingly switches from visions to oracles, indicating a difference in author. James Hartle has answered this objection, however, stating that 2 points of continuity exist between both parts. That is, with respect to genre and the use of oracles, including the symbolic actions found in 6 verses 9 through 15, 11 verses 4 through 17. And even though vast differences in style between the parts are visible, the use of these literary forms helps link Proto to Deutero Zechariah. And Mark Boda contends, claiming that the visions within the first 8 chapters are complicated, positing that visions 1, 4, 5, and 8 are part of a common effort. If these 4 vision reports cannot be separated from each other, therefore, and visions 1 through 4 display connections to the processes which saw Zechariah's visions 1 and 8 come together into its final form, then one person that is, can discern here at least a common literary effort. Visions 2 and 3 and visions 6 and 7 do not contain major lexical links to the other vision reports. And remarkably, visions 2 and 3 fit with the vision report sequence in terms of theme by filling out the 2-step restoration program laid out in the oracles of the first vision report. Boda concludes, reasoning that the evidence highlights points of connection among the larger corpus of the first part of Zechariah. One can surmise, therefore, 2 autobiographical accounts, with one related to visionary experience, whilst the latter to non-visionary experience, which included oracles, sermons, and reports. These visionary and non-visionary experiences seemingly point to 2 authors who mimic the prophet formula used by Zechariah himself. Peter Gentry, however, thinks otherwise, arguing that the author's tendency to introduce a new topic, or in this case, a new vision, in a mysterious manner, and then to delay the exposition of it until later key information that enables readers to understand what is being described has been provided. Gentry illustrates his point through Isaiah 13 and the Oris, or oracle concerning Babylon. The reader will see the prophecies arranged in a small chiasm, with Yahweh summoning his warriors, and then the day of Yahweh or judgment, followed by Yahweh summoning his warriors again, namely the Medes. One will notice as well, or as Gentry does, then that the first and last sections of this chapter provide the reader with the necessary information. These visions, therefore, are more than likely not the work of two autobiographers, but rather the work of a singular author based on the authorial intent. Furthermore, simply because the genre or writing style changes does not necessarily mean that more than one author is at work here. Much debate surrounds the latter half of the book surrounding authorship and compilation. With his publication way back in 1784, yes, folks, 1784, on his Die Weissagungen, welche bei den Schriften des Propheten Zacharias beigebogen sind. Pfluger, that's his name, Pfluger, was the first to divide the book into 9 separate prophecies, after which this scholar also assigned various dates to each prophecy. Moreover, Pfluger suggested that their appearance was possible because Zechariah collected and preserved them, seemingly implying a compiler rather than a prophet receiving a word from the Lord. A few decades later, another German scholar by the name of Karodi in 1792, we're still way back there, was the first scholar to posit a date for the latter half of the book of Zechariah. More specifically, chapter 9 to the time of Alexander the Great, and chapter 14 to the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanius, implying multiple authorship. Yet again, in 1881, Stad in his Deutero Zachariah eine kritische Studie concluded that chapters 9 through 14 are the work of one author who wrote during the second half of the Wars of the Diadochi, having taken place between 306 and 278 BCE. In his monograph, Boda divides further the latter half of the book into 2 sections, that is 9 through 11 and 12 through 14. Boda cites phrases such as Ko Amer Adonai, thus saith the Lord, indicates a new section at 12 verse 1. He also acknowledges a shift of style from chapter 8 into chapter 9 when the writer or writers switch from visions to prophecies. Hartle is quick to note against both Stad and Boda, however, that the expression b'yom hahu, that is, in that day, occurs 3 times in Proto-Zechariah and 9 times in Deutero-Zechariah. Also, in Deutero-Zechariah, this expression often replaces ko amar Adonai, thus saith the Lord, as an introductory formula to oracles with the effect, mind you, of projecting the fulfillment of certain events into an unknown future time. The many future-oriented oracles in Deutero-Zechariah result in a consecration of this phrase there. Its use in Proto-Zechariah links the 2 parts together and may indicate that what has been initiated or promised there will be concluded by the events portrayed in Deutero-Zechariah. These small phrases, therefore, seemingly indicate more unity within the book rather than disunity. Furthermore, Hill states that an examination of the archaeological discovery and socio-political considerations conform to an early Persian date for chapters 9 through 14. This author would agree with Hartle in that the book of Zechariah is the product of a singular author, roughly around the Persian period, say the 5th century. Additionally, Paul Lamarche supported Stade's claim, whilst at the same time considered Robinson by stating that chapters 9 through 14 are the work of a single author who lived around 500 to 480 BCE. Additionally, Hill indirectly supports Lamarche, who noticed an arrangement of seemingly diverse pericopes weaved into a chiastic structure or pattern. Lamarche also understood that the author of these chapters used 4 themes arranged Chiastically, to portray the ultimate victory of the kingdom of God, the day of Yahweh would be brought in by the messianic king, and finally, the surrounding nations, as well as Judah and Jerusalem, would be judged and purged by war. Idolatry would cease, and Yahweh would be universally worshipped in Jerusalem. Along with the diverse pericopes woven into chiastic structures, the unity of the first 8 chapters, and finally the seamless transition between chapters 8 and 9 on the topic of the salvation of nations into the nations who were inimical, leads this writer to conclude that the book of Zechariah was the work of one author. So we're going to focus now on the strengths and weaknesses of each view of authorship in the book of Zechariah. So one of the main weaknesses in the single authorship approach seems to be in the superscription, in which an editor may have switched from first person to third person. Ralph Smith argues that most dates of Old Testament prophets do not include exact dates, with these dates being rather vague, but they do include the names of kings. Another weakness in the single authorship argument is found with Boda, who posits that the visions could be the work of 2 autobiographers within the first 8 chapters. And the crux of his argument seems to rest on the disunity of the visions littered throughout the first 8 chapters, including the superscription, which switches from first person to third. As a result, Boda concludes that the first responsible that the one responsible for drawing them together mimic the prophetic formula used by Zechariah himself. This would significantly support a scribal school that developed during or after the prophet lived, similar to a possible scribal school with the prophet Isaiah. A strength, however, supporting the single authorship of Zechariah is the mention of the son of Iddo and the name of Berechiah, since the Hebrew word ben can be used not only for son, but also descendant. Additionally, the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis follows suit, stating that ben means son, grandson, or a member of a family. Both Iddo and Berechiah could be the ancestors of the prophet Zechariah, therefore, rather than indicating 2 different and distinct Zechariahs. Another strength is the unity within the first 8 chapters. Both Hill and Smith seem to give a convincing argument in their explanation of the first 8 chapters, with Smith indicating that the first 8 chapters have been well dated. Hill's argument is rather convincing for the single authorship view because of the absence of the completion of both the temple and its dedication, implying that the writer would have been rather careful to include both in his book. Strengths and weaknesses of the multiple authorship view. One of the main strengths of the multiple authorship view is the argument that 2 biographers may have contributed to the visions within the first 8 chapters of Zechariah. Interestingly, Boda connects visions 1 and 4, 2 and 3, and finally 6 and 7 through literary themes and a related visionary experience. This, Boda claims, is the result of 2 autobiographers, possibly Proto and Deutero Zechariah, who related visionary experience and non-visionary experience. Another strength that went unmentioned above is the historical anachronisms. The geographical and historical references in chapters 9 through 14 do not fit readily into the Hellenistic period. Hwang is careful to note that whilst Greece is mentioned in Zechariah 9:13, the sequence of sites described in the preceding itinerary differ from Alexander's campaign in 332 BCE. Additionally, Alexander never campaigned against Damascus, and the pride of the Philistines had already been defeated by Egypt at the end of the 7th century. A weakness is found in the seeming confusion among chapters 9 and 14. Although Boda notices a shift in style from chapter 8 into chapter 9, this shift does not necessarily indicate a change in authorship as well. Peter Gentry sums up the argument nicely, countering that one must consider authorial intent. Another example Gentry uses is found in Isaiah 15 with the oracle against Moab. Once again here, Gentry offers another chiasm throughout the plea for safety in Zion and the pride of Moab, which are at the heart of the message. Furthermore, Andrew Hill demonstrates another weakness in that if the multiple authorship holds water, the absence of the completion of the temple and its dedication are striking. Seemingly, this absence indicates an authorship whose date is better suited to the 6th century. So this one, we're going to talk about the similarities and dissimilarities against the backdrop of the Pentateuch and Isaiah. Although each view of authorship developed uniquely, some similarities and dissimilarities do exist among the three views of authorship. Seemingly, the view of authorship of Zechariah and Isaiah developed a similar model of authors, namely 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah, as well as 1st and 2nd, and possibly 3rd Zechariah, based on changes of style, grammar, and genre. Richard Schultz notes the development of the view of authorship within Isaianic studies, in which this scholar outlays the pivotal moment when Doom posited a distinction among three different independent authors, dividing the book up with Proto-Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, and finally Trito-Isaiah, based on similar differences elaborated below concerning the book of Zechariah. Similarly, the multiple authorship view of Zechariah also includes three possible authors. James Hartle explains that this approach is based on a dissimilar literary style, differences in content, the fact that Zechariah's name is not mentioned in chapters 9 through 14 as it is in chapters 1 through 8, the seemingly diverse historical background behind each pericope in Deutero-Isaiah, and finally, the more apocalyptic style of chapters 9 through 14, particularly with chapter 14. Interestingly, this multiple authorship view is, or at least this multiple authorship is absent in the Pentateuch, which developed from four composite redactors or strands into one document as a result of one compiler. Baden postulates four originally independent documents that have been combined into the single text of the canonical Pentateuch using Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis, or more accurately, building on Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis, using it as a springboard from which to launch and build his theory. This approach, when applied to Zechariah, is missing in Isaiah as well, where each alleged document can stand on its own, whereas according to the views of multiple authorship surrounding both Isaiah and Zechariah, seemingly developed around a scribal school. This alleged scribal school is absent with the Pentateuch, since each source did not receive layers or development through the centuries, according to Baden. Furthermore, where the alleged Deutero-Isaiah or Trito-Zechariah mimicked Proto-Zechariah, as Boda posits, this seems to be lacking from both the views of multiple authorship in both the Pentateuch and Isaiah. Conclusion. The book of Zechariah seems to point towards single authorship, expressing both unity and harmony. Though critical scholarship posits a three-author approach, the unity of both genres and themes seem to demonstrate the flow throughout the book, though a noticeable shift does appear from chapters 8 and 9, or chapters 8 to 9. Both the single and multiple authorship views demonstrate both strengths and weaknesses, as no argument is free from scrutiny and observation. And finally, similarities and dissimilarities exist with the development of the single and multiple authorship views when put against the backdrop of the Pentateuch and Isaiah. More similarities seem to exist rather than dissimilarities when multiple authorship is concerned and literary development as a result. Well, folks, that will conclude this installment of an Old Testament Academic Reacts. I hope you really enjoyed this as I dived into the minor prophets, which seems to be out of my element a little bit. Let me know in the comments section below your thoughts on this topic, whether you disagree or agree with the multiple authorship or single authorship. And as always, I would like, if you guys like this sort of content, please don't hesitate to subscribe. And if you wish to support the channel financially, again, I will go ahead and list, or at least put the link to my Patreon in the description below as well. Take care, guys.